That night has been by far the scariest and most terrifying night of my life. And it's ironic, because it was the one time I actually decided to do something fun and different. And it turned out to be the worst experience of my life. I consider myself a humble person. I keep to myself and try not to make any enemies. I'm loved by my wife and 2 daughters, and as the simple man that I am, I ask for nothing else. To me, I have achieved the best things. However, a lot of my friends and even my wife have often told me that I should do more exciting things, take more risks, and go out there and have fun. I thought they were absolutely out of their minds, but when I turned 40, I did some self-reflecting and they were right. I had spent all my years working, trying to provide for my family. Before then, all I ever did was study and obtain degrees. I needed to do something more fun for me, something different, an adventure. That is how I made the decision to go with it, just me and no one else. Everyone I told was excited for me, and they told me to film my process. Some even offered to come with me, but I wanted to do this alone. So before then, I tried to get in shape and prepare my mind for the task at hand. The day finally came, and I had them drive me to the middle of nowhere and just drop me off. I was supposed to find my way back home somehow later that day. It was not your average adventurous hitchhiking, but it was my first time, and I needed to do it alone, my way. A few minutes after I was dropped in the middle of nowhere, I began to walk. And if I'm being honest, I was enjoying myself. The feel of the sun on my face, the sounds of my boots on the road, and just the way children waved at me from cars that passed by. I began to wonder why I had not thought of this earlier, why I hadn't done something as great as this before. Either way, I was determined to make the best of this, perhaps make it a habit. Little did I know the danger and horror that awaited me later that day. Over the next few hours, I had visited a different city and gone sightseeing. It was the best thing I had ever done, and it was getting a little bit late and I needed to head back home, and that was how my nightmare began. I thought people loved hitchhikers and would give them a ride whenever they had their thumbs up. But for hours, I stood by the side of the road, trying to hail cars that were driving by. For one, the road seemed a bit empty. There were not a lot of cars passing by, and I wondered why. There was also no cell phone service, so I could not reach any of my friends and family. As the sun began to set, I realized I was in trouble, and I was desperate to get home. My boots were killing me, and my thighs were on fire. With every single step I took, it got harder to go on. And it seemed like by the minute, it was getting darker and darker, and as it got darker, it was beginning to get chilly. My heart was beating really hard against my chest, and it was getting too dark to see. I realized I could not go on. I sat on the dirt and placed my bag by my side. I was going to wait for a vehicle to pass by and hopefully they would stop and give me a ride. It was literally my only chance, and I knew I could not afford to go on the way I was. I would probably faint and drop. The darkness descended in a creepy way, and I found myself looking frantically around me. Everything seemed dangerous, and it didn't help that I was standing right outside the woods. There were cricket sounds, and I could literally hear some leaves rustling in the background. I stood on my feet and glanced behind me. It was too dark to see anything, but I knew what I heard, so I dragged myself a few feet away from there. Finally, I heard a vehicle coming from the horizon, and I couldn't hide my excitement. I began to wave my hands in the air, calling out for the driver to stop. It turned out to be a truck, but I didn't care. I waved more frantically than I ever had, and I was determined to bring the truck to a stop. It was my only hope for survival. But the truck didn't seem to be slowing down, and I was getting more desperate. I ran into the middle of the road and waved my hand some more, almost blinded by the lights. But the truck didn't slow down, and it didn't even honk. As it came closer, I had to dive off the road to avoid being hit, and I watched the truck drive past me. I was almost in a state of tears. I had no idea what to do. I was either going to be eaten alive or die of cold in this freezing darkness. Just then, something strange happened. The truck, which was already a few meters ahead of me, suddenly stopped and began to reverse towards me. I was overjoyed. I picked up my bags and my boot and ran towards the truck. "Thank you," I said breathlessly to the trucker. He didn't seem like an everyday trucker. He seemed a lot less chatty and weird, but I didn't care. I also didn't know enough about truckers to even have an opinion on the subject. As I got in and told him where I was going, he simply nodded and gave a low grunt as he moved the truck again. I glanced at my watch and realized it was almost 11 p.m. My family would be so worried about me, and when I checked my phone, I realized I had no cell service. I asked the trucker if I could use his cell phone, but he shook his head. "No cell service," he said. I settled in my chair and tried to relax. I was grateful to be seated after a long day and my legs were finally resting. It was about 2 more hours to my city, and I knew there would be cell service before then. As we moved, I began to feel uncomfortable. There was something strange about the trucker. He wore a sleeveless shirt with a weird tattoo on his arm, and another smaller tattoo on his face, and he kept stealing glances at me almost like he wanted to check if I was asleep. I was very sleepy, and all I wanted to do was lay down and get some much-needed rest. But my heart was not at peace, and so I fought the sleep that was claiming me. Finally, the trucker stopped abruptly in the middle of the road, in the middle of nowhere, and stared into space as if he had seen something. I gasped and looked right in front of us, but there was nothing but darkness. I asked him what the problem was, but he simply sat there, almost frozen. When I asked again, he grunted, "They're here." "Who's here?" I asked him, but he did not respond. He simply sat there quietly. Then all of a sudden, he rushed out of the truck and fled into the woods. I was petrified and unsure what to do. I began to hyperventilate and stare into the darkness to see who he was running from or what it was. But there was no one. I knew something was wrong with the trucker the moment I entered his truck. I got down myself and squinted my eyes to try to adjust to the darkness. Maybe it was just me, but I felt something was there, just beyond the coat of darkness a few yards from me. And as I stared harder, I could make out some figures in the darkness that seemed to be closing in on me. I cursed under my breath and got back into the truck where it was safe. And that was when I realized the trucker had left the keys in the ignition. Without hesitation, I jumped into the driver's seat and turned on the ignition. I put the lights in full, and that was the first time I actually saw the creatures that stood in front of the truck, shrouded by the darkness. There was only one thing to do. I slammed the throttle and rammed into them until I got past them. I eventually made it home, but somehow, I feel like they would come back for me. They were not human, and I might be right in the middle of some strong voodoo.